This is Wretched Radio with Todd Friel.
The theology of Martin Luther King Jr. This is Wretched Radio at the MLK 50 conference held in Memphis, courtesy of the Southern Baptist Ethics and Religious Committee organization thing headed up by Russell Moore, also from the Gospel Coalition. Spent several days sharing the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., and it appears that only one speaker had the courage to suggest, and it should be more than a suggestion, his theology was not orthodox. Now, I believe that that is a bit contested these days, so let's jump in. Should we have held a conference for a man who would historically have been considered a heretic? I think we'd agree no, shouldn't do that, any more than we should uplift anybody in that fashion, especially at a Christian conference, especially with using the person's teachings and making them biblical and presenting them from a man who's outside of orthodoxy. I don't think that we would do that with anything or anybody. Would we? Would we hold a Gandhi 100 conference? He did do some good things, but you'd go, well, no, he wasn't a Christian. Exactly. And that's what we need to examine before we go about the business of hosting a conference with somebody's name on it, because theology is more important than racial issues. If that was offensive to you, hang on. Theology is more important than abortion. Theology is more important than sexual issues. Theology is more important than any issue, because it's a representation of God's character and nature, and the most slanderous, wicked, awful thing any human being can do. You think of whatever perversion you would like to. Worse is to slander the character and the nature of God by speaking about him authoritatively and falsely. That's the biggest sin there is. And so for an entire conference to just gloss over that, I have to confess to you, demonstrates why I believe that this was an ill-conceived idea. If they wanted to do a conference on the issue of race, I think that case could be made. With Martin Luther King Jr.'s name on it, we're Christians. We're theologians first. Let's take a look at his theology, shall we? There are 3 strikes. It only requires 1 when it's an essential issue. Martin Luther King Jr. did not believe in the virgin birth of Jesus Christ, the divinity of Jesus Christ, or the physical bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. I've read enough online where people are saying, wait a second, he did say in 1957, after he graduated from seminary, when he denied the resurrection of Jesus Christ, where he affirmed the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Let me make a statement. You tell me if you agree with this or not. I believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, that Jesus Christ, he rose, period. You'd go amen. You know who else would go amen? Marcus Borg, who denies the resurrection. Well, how can both people agree with that statement? Because you and I were thinking bodily resurrection. Martin Luther King Jr. was not. He was thinking of a spiritual resurrection. So you're correct. In 1957, he made statements that made it sound like he affirmed the resurrection. The problem is with what the definition of resurrection is. Furthermore, if you then take a sermon after 1957, which, by the way, this is rather telling, that nobody's been able to find a clear gospel presentation from Martin Luther King Jr. Nobody? With the exception of this one 1957 sermon where he affirmed the resurrection. But then, it's not to say, by the way, that he never talked about Jesus. He just never made a clear gospel presentation, to the best of my knowledge. In 1959, he delivered another sermon. It was a walk through the Holy Land Easter Sunday sermon delivered at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, 29 March 1959 in Montgomery, Alabama. So if we're doing our math, that's after 1957. I will cut to the chase and get to near the end of the sermon. Martin Luther King Jr. Even when he died on a cross, one of the most ignominious deaths that we can ever point to in history, he had to be buried in a borrowed grave. We stood in there. But that guide began to talk, and he became eloquent when he talked about it. He said, but I want you to know that this tomb is empty. He is not there now. This is just a symbol of where he was, but he isn't there now. That's what the guide said. Martin Luther King Jr. says, whatever you believe about the resurrection this morning isn't important. Whatever you believe about the resurrection this morning isn't important. An Orthodox person would only say that as a complete error. The form that you believe in, that isn't the important thing. Why? Because Martin Luther King Jr. demonstrating that he was being consistent with his doctoral thesis denying the resurrection of Jesus Christ. He goes on. The fact that he misspoke. He said revelation, but the fact that the resurrection is something that nobody can refute, that is the important thing. Some people felt, the disciples felt, that it was a physical resurrection, that the physical body got up. Then Paul came onto the scene. So the disciples thought it was physical. Paul, he's going to share, thought it was merely spiritual. Then Paul came on the scene, who had been trained in Greek philosophy, who knew a little about Greek philosophy, and had read a little, probably of Plato and others who believed in the immortality of the soul, and he tried to synthesize the Greek doctrine of the immortality of the soul with the Jewish Hebrew doctrine of resurrection. Oh, is that what he was doing? And he talked, as you remember, and you read right now, about a spiritual body. Sorry, I jumped ahead. And he talked, as you remember, and you read it, about a spiritual body. A spiritual body. Whatever form, that isn't important right now. The important thing is that the resurrection did occur. The important thing is that the grave was empty. The important thing is the fact that Jesus had given himself to certain eternal truths and eternal principles that nobody could crucify and escape. Now, does that sound like orthodoxy to you? Furthermore, I don't know that this ever gets to that these eternal truths were about Jesus Christ receiving the wrath of God on the sinner's behalf so that we might be forgiven and set free. They were eternal truths, but it doesn't appear to be gospel truth. The theology of Martin Luther King Jr., at best, is in question, at best. Let me share with you from John Piper, who spoke at the Martin Luther King 50 conference, where he had the courage to say, let's be careful here, quote, he was blinded to the truth and beauty as Christ's majesty as creator of the universe, blinded to the glory of Christ's grace in suffering imputed guilt from others, blinded to the all-encompassing authority of Christ that he received when he rose bodily from the dead. Well, he only missed the virgin birth in there, and maybe the deity of Jesus Christ. So, well, no, actually, he did get the deity as the creator of the universe, so he hit on 2 of the 3 strikes. Now, John Piper continued, in his early 20s, Martin Luther King turned away from these great objective biblical realities. And you can read about it with sadness in many of his papers in those days. How could anybody speak at a conference like that? Sorry, I know it kind of came across as a joke, but why not Gandhi 100? Gandhi was as orthodox as Martin Luther King Jr., who was an Orthodox. We wouldn't do a conference to celebrate his memory, I hope not. Elvis 40? Or is he 50 now? Is Elvis up to, that would be, so it'd be Elvis 40. Let's do something to commemorate. Hey, Elvis, there was a Bible on his nightstand when he died. In the bathroom on the toilet floor from a drug overdose. But the point is, you would go, well, that wouldn't be appropriate. And I'm not certain that Elvis was more or less promiscuous than Martin Luther King Jr. Now, this needs to be said from John Piper. I don't know if he came home. Many believe he did. A speaker in the earlier panel documented to the point at which he thought he came home and met God in a profound way. I hope so. Well, I do too. Of course I do. I mean, seriously. Because don't worry, Martin Luther King Jr. and his sins of philandering, the orgies that he participated in, all can be forgiven. That's how great Jesus is when it comes to saving. But if at best his theology is questionable, And it doesn't appear that there's any clear recantation, which you would expect from somebody who wrote doctoral theses that involved heresy, some sort of public denunciation. Without that, we'd like to, hopefully he did, but we don't know at best. Why would we do a conference celebrating a legacy, and you can call it a good legacy, of social advances, but not when the individual's so stained and at best so controversial? This could have been a helpful conference, but I think that the premise was flawed from the get-go, and sadly, best I can tell, the execution of it was equally flawed, and the outcome of it has not been a happy result of more unity and love in the body. That is a mark worth noting. This is Wretched Radio. Thank you very much for watching one segment. You can listen to 3 more, well, if you can stomach it, for free at wretched.org, iTunes, Android, whatever your listening device is. If you have a plate in your head, you can pick up the program from anywhere around the world, thanks to the ongoing monthly support of our gospel partners. Should you be one of the people who has listened to the program for an extended period of time, meaning more than once, would you please consider becoming a gospel partner so we can continue to proclaim the good news of the gospel? Simply visit wretched.org.